If you just joined us, I'm Sarah Razor with NASCA, and we are getting ready to kick off our next session on transition and implementation. So we'll focus on Tennessee's approach to procurement, operations, customers, and employees. So to get us started, I'd like to ask our panelists just to go ahead and introduce ourselves. And just a quick reminder, if you are watching via live stream, we'd love to have you participate in the Q&A session. You can just email the email address that's below the feed, and we'll read your question during the Q&A time. So please participate and check out the resources underneath your feed. So with that, you guys want to get us started? Thanks.
Hello, everyone. My name is Trey Norris. For those of you who weren't able to go to dinner last night and those of you on the live stream, I am a category specialist for our central procurement office. And while I wasn't involved directly in the first procurement, I actually started working here the month before it was awarded. So it was very much the talk of the office when I started. And I ran the second procurement for our office, so I had to familiarize myself with this one that is the focus of our conference, because it's obviously been a huge success, and I wanted to take the best elements of that and put it in ours. So here you have a high-level timeline of the transition as it relates to transitioning our existing state contracts to JOL once the contract started. So I'll talk at a high level here about each of these steps, and then Mike and I will drill down a little bit into the actual process. As Tommy mentioned earlier, we had an inefficient contracting system for a lot of these services contracts. I think 107 janitorial, so there was a lot of work to do. So another thing that was mentioned yesterday was that the contractor had a transition team they provided with representatives for each key subject matter area, procurement being one of them. So we had someone from JOL working collaboratively with our leadership to ensure a seamless transition. So the contract was awarded April 1st, at the actual with a 90-day transition period, but it actually didn't get kicked off in terms of the transition until about mid-April. So between mid-April and our go-live date of July 1st, two things happened. All the state contractors were notified that their contracts with the state were being assigned to JOL, and all the contract terms and conditions were put on JOL paper. Even if they weren't able to get the full deal done, since JOL is now going to be the principal, it was very important to at least get to that step. And Mike will probably get into it in a little bit, but you know, JOL's philosophy isn't to come in and clean house on day one. You want to see how some of the current contracts are operating, get a better feel for the relationships, everything like that, before deciding whether to renegotiate, rebid, consolidate, etc. So the first step here was to identify all of our current services contracts and some of those areas you see there. And which was a big undertaking in our office, the Edison system that was mentioned earlier thankfully was in place, so we had a good repository for a lot of these things. But we ended up identifying over 430 contracts falling into these areas. So it was a big undertaking, and what we did was that we gathered the following pieces of information for each contract. We got a copy of the contract, the vendor, the type of service it was, the contact information, the term of the contract, and the especially important thing as it relates to KPIs, which I won't get too much into, was the diversity status of the vendor. That was a KPI, and so small, women, minority-owned, service-disabled veteran. That's a big emphasis of our office. We have a Governor's Office of Diversity Business Enterprise that actually is a part of our works in our office. So that's a really big emphasis for us. So once these contracts had been identified, we put them in an Excel sheet organized by location and sent out to the vendor. And one important thing to note is that there are Tennessee statewide contracts used by more than one agency that were not part of the transition. The 430 contracts we're talking about here are the contracts that are used by one of the agencies that was under the centralized kind of control of Stream. And however, JOL does have the ability under both this first contract and will under the new one to use our statewide contracts in the rare event that we have better pricing, which has only happened once, but it's good to have that flexibility for our state agencies so that we can ensure that we're getting the best price, even if it is 99% of the time going to be them because of their buying power. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mike, and he will talk a little more about the process.
Thank you, Trey. I'm Mike Perry. I serve as the state's Chief Procurement Officer, and I think you've heard the sheer weight of managing 430 contracts, how difficult that could be. So we had to analyze each one of those contracts side by side with JLL to determine the disposition of each one. So we had the option to terminate for convenience. You know, if this was something that could be self-performed by JLL employees starting day one, we could assign them, legally assign them to JLL, or JLL could manage some of the contracts on behalf of the state. Ultimately, we decided to assign all the contracts to JLL. And so that shifted all liability and responsibility from the state to JLL. That was a huge lift off our shoulders, as you might expect. So now we have one contract to manage, not 430, and so I like to call it the one throat to choke. So if we have issues, I go look for Tom Foster. He's the one guy we look for. And so that is a huge, huge benefit. So as Trey also alluded to, a lot of these vendors were small, minority-owned, woman-owned, or service-disabled, veteran-owned. Some of the janitorial contracts were to our community rehabilitation agency, who works with vendors who employ persons with intellectual or physical disabilities. So it was important to us that we had some continuity there. So JLL, I'm happy to report, 34% currently of the spend on this initial contract are to those categories of business, far exceeding the 25% we had even envisioned and far exceeding the level of spend that the state had previously. So that was a big win for us and continues to be. Also, 92% of the dollars on this contract stay in Tennessee, another big win. So this can be a positive economic impact on your particular states. So as Trey already said, we notified by letter each one of these particular 430 contractors. As you might imagine, the phone started ringing. And so I think we somewhat underestimated, just how much would be required of us. A lot of hand-holding, a lot of explanation, a lot of reassuring these vendors. And so I think that's a lesson learned that David alluded to earlier. Likewise, JLL, closely on the heels of our notification, they notified each one of these vendors and basically gave them a packet of information. You can see that listed here, requesting the basic information, remit to, bill to addresses, the W-9 form, certificate of insurance because they were coming on state property performing work, how to register in their system, and also how to avail themselves of opportunities to become a JLL supplier in addition to what they'd previously done for the state. In addition to that, I don't know if you have this requirement, but we require any prime contractor to get attestations from subcontractors that they are not employing undocumented workers in performance of a contract for the state of Tennessee. So that was another step that they undertook on our behalf. To give you an idea of what happened to some of these contracts, so as we already said, the 430, so just in the downtown area, we had 5 different janitorial suppliers. They were able to leverage that to one supplier, and through their global buying power, the first year we saved $750,000. Another good story is on security. They actually continued using the security company, which was a woman-owned business that we had used, but renegotiated that contract, again with their economic buying power, and reduce costs by $750,000 a year. So you can see we had some instant economic impact and benefits to state government. They had a wonderful transition team. We learned a lot through that process that will help us on this second contract. Again, many lessons learned, but I can assure you that if you decide to go with a managed service provider that is eminently qualified to perform these services, this will not be their first rodeo with you as well. And they have done this many, many times, and it was very seamless. Again, assigning the contracts guaranteed continuity of service so that there was minimal impact on our customers or our state employees and citizens who use our buildings. And that was very important to us, that this whole process be blind to them. So with that, we will answer questions at the end of the complete panel, and I believe, Kevin, are you next?
I'm Kevin Powell. I'm the Director of Facilities Management for DGS Stream. I came to the state, I'm going right out 6 years ago. I came in right after Stream was first born, so to speak, and I was hired as a FA with Property Services Management. So I was technically part of the problem that we're talking about. I was there. So I'm going to concentrate on part of the problems, how we operated before the outsourcing. As we've talked about and people that have mentioned, we had no standardized systems. There was no set CMMS system. We had no way of tracking any preventive maintenance that were done. We had no way of tracking work orders that were put in. We had no way to track anything. People would put in work orders by walking around, finding a maintenance worker and telling them. We would not, as FAs, even know what our workers were necessarily doing during the day, how many things they fixed, what they were doing. We, to my knowledge, while I was there, had never even mentioned the word customer survey. It's just we would walk around, talk to the tenants, see what was going on. We would get their ideas of what we were or weren't doing that way. Needless to say, a very, very inefficient way of handling business. So because we had no information, we had no way to establish a baseline of anything. We were in the dark ages. Also, that's been touched on, we offered the employees no formal training. We had job descriptions of electricians, plumbers. We did not offer any certifications. Any way to make their job more efficient and easier. We just did not do it. Because of that, and because, once again, the state employees were not exactly paid on private scale, it made it very difficult to attract anybody, and if you did attract a quality employee, it almost made it impossible to retain them. They would go find better work somewhere else, and who could blame them? So as some of you have mentioned in my discussions with you, I think everyone here knows that they have deferred maintenance. Here at the state, we would, if it wasn't broke, we would pay it no attention. It was run to fail is an understatement of how we would do it. If you had redundant systems, you would run those systems until they failed. On top of that, those underpaid, uncertified employees are who we depended on to keep up with our preventive maintenance programs because we didn't have a CMS system. So when you realize that you've got deferred maintenance, when you realize that you've neglected your buildings, you don't really truly understand how deep that goes until you have someone outside your system, a third party, come in and look at your buildings, assess them. And that's what happened with us. When those reports and those pictures start flooding in, you realize how deep of a hole you're starting from. So before I start showing you some of these pictures, a couple things. You remember the picture of the man in the hazmat suit in the fresh air intake air handler, part of an air handler, also the windows that were falling out of the building. We could actually sit here and show you picture after picture after picture of that type of thing. So needless to say, that filter media had not been changed in quite a long time. So as most of you I see are holding your breath, the tenants didn't have the benefit of seeing this. That is air. Yeah, exactly.
I'm sure everybody knows.
This is air filter media. So this is filters after the cooling, after the cools, and before it goes into the air handler system and through the ducts to you to breathe. This is what it was blowing through, or trying to blow through. Idea. We weren't keeping up with any preventive maintenance. Also shows that we were not making the correlation between preventive maintenance and possible benefits of extending useful life as well as efficiencies of operation. This air-cooled chiller is obviously not going to circulate air and cool nearly as well as one that's kept clean. We paid it no attention. This is our access control system. So not only did we neglect mechanical systems, the if it's working, leave it alone attitude went to every aspect of our buildings. This is sad. This is what we depend to keep the bad people out, and we're just ignoring it. And before I get to the next one, well, we'll just go ahead. I'll let that sit there for a second and look, because it's kind of like a Find the Waldo picture. Yes, that is a urinal, and yes, that is the main electrical switchgear for the entire building, and this is a 10-story office building in downtown Nashville. Oh, by the way, so every one of these pictures, as well as every one of John's pictures, are from different facilities. They're not just one neglected building that we're showing you. This is enterprise-wide situation. But I do have to give them credit. They did self-perform. They did install this. And they did consider HR issues. They installed a shower curtain for privacy. Exactly.
A lot of time in that room.
Yeah, so this was, once again, something that leadership had no idea was going on. Just the people who did this knew it was there. And, of course, absolutely unacceptable. It was one of the first things that JLL did was yank that out. But, I mean, it just gives an idea of where we started from. We had no tracking of anything. The workers that were doing this type of thing. So I've always used, recently I've used the analogy that we've gone from the Flintstones to the Jetsons. Pretty accurate, actually. So.
Just to add on to what Kevin's saying, I mean, that was our experience a few years ago. As we get ready to do this again, we have another 24 million square feet out there. Within the agency's actual control at this point, so we'll take our next set of pictures as we get started with that as well.
I have one other comment. We've heard the legislators pick up on this, and I'm glad they are. John and I'll go around and speak with them, and then we'll talk about budget reduction time. And so what happens is they'll cut their operating budgets for maintenance, right? Out of sight, out of mind, doesn't affect services, doesn't affect employees. They just cut those costs. So they're very focused on, so they may be trying to put through a bill that it would not allow them to cut their maintenance funds to meet their budget reduction request. So that's just something that may resonate with them about fiscal responsibility. You mean they're able to do this? Are you turning this in on as part of your budget reduction request? Absolutely not. General Services is saying that to them. But the other agencies are still doing that. So, the mentality back then was, well, if we're trying to cut costs, doesn't that mean don't spend any money? Exactly. Don't spend any money, it means don't fix anything. Don't replace a filter. Don't replace a belt.
Yeah,
Use the redundant system until it fails. Isn't that what you've asked me to do? So you have to be very clear on what your expectations are when you say you've got to reduce your cost, as Mike said. Or, you've got to think of this differently. Well, then, okay, that makes sense. Then don't spend any money. Don't buy parts. Prop open the louver with a 2x4. I mean, whatever it is. But do not spend money is what you've told me to do.
The prior administrations to outsourcing definitely considered it bad stewardship of the money to spend maintenance dollars on the buildings. You didn't do that. It was a bad use of money. That was the philosophy.
Well, the additional add-on to that, actually, as we travel around the state and we look at, general government, by the way, has over 4,600 buildings that the state owns. It took us a while. I know some of you other states have said we don't know what we own. We didn't know either. So we sent one of our people around the state for a year trying to figure out county by county what we own, and we did. But what happened to us over time as these buildings were neglected, we have a number of buildings, you may have the same, which we just walked away from. They're literally just buildings that are there, they're shuttered, or an agency will say, well, I use that for some storage of some things, but a lot of our buildings need to be demoed, frankly. So going forward, that'll be an ask of ours to give us funding to demo some of these buildings that are just sitting there that haven't been dealt with at all. In my area, I'd just like to talk to you a little bit about the customers and really stakeholders in all this. And I'll tag team with Tommy a little bit because the last one on here is about state employees, and I won't go too much into his area as the slides go forward. But what's in this, frankly, for customers? What are the state agencies saying? And this is just some of the things that I hear from them. The state agencies just want to know, well, when are you going to fix our buildings? And when are you going to do it? Please, we have needs, so just get it done for us. So the state agencies have a lot to say about that. They don't actually care how. Just get it done for us. The legislature, though, one of their main concerns, and we felt the effects of this, particularly the second time as we went out for procurement, is about how's this going to affect the state employees. And we've made a big decision the second time around compared to the first time around is that we're actually protecting all of their jobs the second time around. So there will be no reductions in force. They're all guaranteed jobs. But that came as a big lessons learned from the first time, and as the legislature has looked at this. Another big question the legislature has asked us is how much is JLL making over all this? I mean, they really want to know. I wouldn't say down to the penny, but pretty close. How are they making money? They just don't quite understand how we can outsource this to a private company like a big company like JLL. They make money, and then we say, well, we're saving money. So we had to spend a lot of time and a lot of meetings and go over a lot of aspects of that about how we actually save money through all this, and then what are they actually making through all this. The governor's office then is the opposite. Well, how much are you going to save through all of this? So that's what they want to know because, again, our purpose is to redeploy those dollars somewhere else. And then the state employees themselves, really, in the end, they want a better place to work. You know, they work in these offices and these leases actually around the state where the landlords themselves don't take care of their places real well either. And they want a better place to work in the end. And again, they don't really care how you get there, but get there for us. And then obviously the ones who are FM employees, immediately as soon as they're hearing procurement, how does that affect me? And so some of this is, maybe I can ask Tommy to go through some of his slides with you.
Probably one of the harder things that I've done in my 44 years with state government is doing a reduction in force. You tend to forge relationships and friendships with the employees and so forth. So suddenly one day you're talking to them as an employee, and tomorrow you're having to tell them your job is being abolished. I've done 6 of these in my career. None of them have ever been easy. What we did when we got ready for the first procurement, or as a result of the first procurement, the management decision been made that in our best interest a RIF would be done of the employees that were involved in FM. We wanted to try and make this as soft a landing for the employees as we possibly could, realizing that you weren't going to be able to do something for everybody, but it wasn't going to be for the lack of trying. Okay? If you're considering such an item in your state, okay, some things I would share with you that we did is obviously we developed our plan. We made sure that we followed the HR rules and regs related to a reduction in force. We made sure that we notified the employees enough in advance so that we met the criteria of the law, which at that time was 60 days notice. We also spent a lot of time from our HR office trying to be their best friend as much as possible. We helped them with updating their resumes. We helped them with updating state applications. We made sure we counseled them on, if you are still here on June 30 when your last official day is, this is what you can expect in the way of compensation and benefits on that day. Here's what happens to your accrued leave that you may have. We did everything we could possibly do to, as I said, make this a soft landing spot. As I said, we followed the rules. On April the 3rd, we issued a pre-RIF memo to all the affected staff, primarily to stop the rumors that were swirling around, because if you'd been following the budget presentations and following the governor's amendment to the appropriations bill, you didn't have to be Einstein to be able to read in print what was fixing to happen. So we determined we wanted to do a preemptive strike, if you will, and tell them this is what we're looking at. Your job may be considered. Okay. On April the 25th, we actually issued the 60-day notice. And then, as you heard me talk before, we then worked carefully with those employees for that next 60 days to try and make this as soft a landing as we could. We guided them through the process as what was expected from the employees up to including their last day. If they were still on board at the close of business on June 30, they would receive a $3,200 severance package from the state of Tennessee. They would receive a 2-year assistance from the state to go to any state-funded college or university in the state of Tennessee. And we guaranteed them within 30 days we would give them a lump sum payment for their accrued annual leave and compensatory overtime leave. Okay? Now, how many people opted for this? Let me give you some facts. At the end, there were 108 employees in PSM, our Property Services Management Division, that were affected by this, even though there were 131 positions that were identified. There were actually 108 from the PSM group that were affected. At the end of the day, on July 1st, 29 employees opted to retire. 10 employees found jobs outside of state government. 8 employees opted to, let me get that right. 10 employees found jobs in state government. 8 employees found other jobs in the private sector. 32 employees were actually interviewed and hired by JLL. There were 29 employees that were actually RIF'd. Okay? So percentages were much better than we were afraid they might be. I wish that number had been 0 that were RIF'd, that we could have found something for them to do in state government or a job in JLL or some other private sector, but we weren't successful. Now, all that to also say, early on, when we made the decision to go this plan and to issue our RIF letter, we engaged the Tennessee Employees Association to make sure that they understood what we were doing, the reasons why. We shared with them the detailed plans of what we would be doing with those employees for the next 60 days to make their landing spot as soft as possible. And I think to a large extent, at the time, and I want to emphasize at the time, that seemed to work, and we did not get a whole lot of pushback or criticism. The criticism came about a year and a half later when they really began to question everything about the outsourcing, and then all was fair game. Okay, but initially, I think the efforts we put forth to try and help the employees was probably as good as we could do at that point in time. As you heard David say, if we could do this over, we would probably be much more proactive and much more out front, but that was not the decision that management and state officials determined to make at that point in time. So we noodled through this, and it is what it is. One of the questions that we get occasionally deals with the employees themselves. So there were 32 state employees that initially hired on with JLL. Today, there are still 19 that are employed. I just want to point out a couple of things. If the 19 employees had stayed employed in the state of Tennessee, if I can find it. There you go. So let me sum this. If the employees who were on board in 2013 went to JLL, if they had remained in the state of Tennessee in 2016, their benefits and their compensation would be a little bit over $67,200. Those same employees being employed with JLL, their compensation and benefits is almost $73,600. So did they gain an advantage by going to JLL? Yes. In addition, as you've heard us all talk about on several different occasions, they've also been afforded ongoing training. They've had the opportunity to go to training that would also upgrade their abilities to keep them abreast with what's changing in building technology, and that was something that we were never able to offer. And I would not sit here today and tell you that if they remained on our staff that we'd have been able to do anything now that we weren't able to do then. So by and large, are the employees better off? I'd like to say very much so.
Different version of this slide yesterday that we talked about. One of the things that I would certainly encourage you is to keep your message simple. As the commissioner and I have gone around and we've talked about the savings through this plan, we've tried to boil this down to really 3 points, 3 areas where we believe we have saved money for all this. It is a complicated subject as you're talking to the legislature and other areas and the media about this. For us, we validated $26 million worth of cumulative savings over the last 3 years. We know that that number is going up as we're tracking into the 4th year. So these are the areas that we know we've saved money in, is the self-perform work, the procurement, meaning all those contracts that Mike and Trey talked about, that they do a better job than us and get better costing for us, and then certainly the energy savings, as you know, Kevin said, they're going to clean the filters finally. All those things to make our buildings perform better. So we're tracking those savings and keep this message going year by year by year, keep those same results to build on. It's highly important as you go through the process. Another one tied very closely with that, as you see savings, how is your customer satisfaction doing? It's one of those things that it's certainly well and good to have all those savings, but what are your customers saying about that? As you do the surveys and you get that group of people who are putting in all those work orders, are they really satisfied with the work that's actually being done? So we track that. This is part of our monthly metrics plan that we go over and over again, and we show this to everyone about that. And we track it for leases, by the way. Again, as I would advocate, keep the message simple. One of the things that we have said doesn't work as well. Okay, sorry about that. Keep your message simple, simple, simple. One of the things we say over and over again, facilities management is not our core business. It is not a function of state government just to take care of our buildings. Our real estate and our buildings are a support function, actually, for our agencies, so they can go and do their missions, which is taking care of kids or all the human services or other things out there. So it's not a core function. High-performing buildings save money, and tenants are more satisfied. The only way we said it, we keep saying it, but we prove it in our statistics, and we keep showing those statistics over and over again.
Good morning again. The portion of the transition process I'm going to be addressing for you now is to do with the accounting and financial reporting. In April of 2013, at the time the FM contract was being formalized, we were faced with an unknown, a daunting task. We didn't really know what was on the horizon. So we needed to come up with a way to bridge the gap between our system and the contractor system. I think you'll all agree that building such a bridge between two such disparate operating systems would require a well-founded plan. Whoops. Before we talk about our plan, though, let me set the stage for you. In April of 2013, the state had recently implemented an ERP system for handling accounting, procurement, payment, and payroll functions. However, a system to assist in the management of the facilities management services function was still in its infancy, and there was no useful work order system. In addition, less than 18 months earlier, financial responsibility for this facilities revolving fund and its roughly 10 million square feet of portfolio had transferred to our department. We were very much in need of a plan that was sufficiently detailed so all that the critical elements of this bridge building project between the two systems could come to pass. We did not want the status of our project to look like this at the end of the scheduled 90-day transition period. We wanted and we needed a joint effort by members of both the contractor's team and the state's team so that we could have the status of our project look like this at the end. That being said, I need to let you in on a little personal observation. As Mike alluded to earlier, this was not the contractor's first rodeo, and that was very apparent and very reassuring. They've been through this before with various types of organizations and were proving to be very adept at guiding us through the process. The main responsibility of my staff, members of the state's accounting system team, was to be able to describe and explain to the contractor how our system worked. In addition, it was reassuring to learn that everything did not have to be absolutely, positively, and totally, completely tied up in a neat bow by July 1st, the effective date of the contract. In our experience here in Tennessee, the end of the transition process for the accounting team actually extended a month or so into the new contract period for some aspects of the operation. Most of that extended period had to do with the vendor community understanding they were now to send their invoices to the new FM contractor rather than to the state. In addition, some vendors would need to adjust to a new process of sending a portion of their invoices to the new contractor for those FERF facilities that they served, while continuing to send other invoices for the same kind of service to various other state agencies whose facilities were not in FERF. So let me set the stage for you. What we did was the accounting team was one of 11 teams. There was 11 functional teams that the contractor had set up to track the progress during the transition process. On the accounting side, we identified several accounting subject matter experts on the state side to work with the contractor's accounting team contact person. The contractor's accounting contact was designated as the lead, and he's the one that identified all the key transition steps that we were to track and make sure that we completed to get through the period. We met weekly with him and updated him on our status of all the steps involved. And we did this most of the time via teleconference, sometimes on site. There were 10 key steps that the accounting transition team followed. The first 5 are on this slide. First, a gathering of all the available prior year transactional data from the state's legacy system enabled the contractor to understand then the volume and pattern of the expenditures experienced by the state during the pre-contract period. They needed to know what they were up against, get their arms around it all. Second, the state's chart of accounts would serve as the contractor's roadmap to understanding how the data in the legacy accounting system was organized and help define how the contractor's accounting system differed from the state accounting system. The contractor and the state accounting SMEs, like subject matter experts, held a work session that yielded a crosswalk from the state's chart of accounts over to the contractor's chart of accounts. What was most telling about this process is that how extensive the contractor's chart of accounts was as compared to the state's chart of accounts. By doing this crosswalk, it enabled us to have the contractor, when they started tracking, they could use their existing software, no change of plan or a process on their side, and the same for us. The costs would be incurred in their system, and that it would just be crosswalked and show up like in the same cost buckets that we had been experiencing. It was great for comparison purposes. Third, the contractor set up a separate account to be associated with the new FM contract. In turn, upon being provided the relevant routing information from the contractor's bank, the state was able to set up an ACH process to pay the contractor.
Did you change your terms, your payment terms to vendors? Were you currently a net 60, go to net 30, net 15? Any motivation to change that while you're doing this transition?
There was that, and I'll speak to that in just about very shortly, though. There was a change. The fifth step on the list was reaching an agreement on key performance indicators that would be jointly agreed to on an annual basis and serve as a gauge of the contractor's operational performance and an indication of the state's level of satisfaction. The accounting transition team involved the state's real estate program leaders in the KPI process. They were proved to be a combination of both public-facing and internal reported KPIs, depending on the individual KPI's area of focus. The public-facing KPIs were to be reported monthly to the Governor's Office of Customer-Focused Government on their website. The first two steps on this slide involve coming to an agreement on how the vendors would be paid and how the contractor would be paid. Based on a series of discussions, the contractor's accounting lead prepared documentation outlining how the processes worked. The documentation included a flow chart of each of the processes, complete with the swim lanes of designated responsibilities, and a timeline which indicated when a process must be complete. And to get to your question, it was during this process of working out the payment process that the state agreed to allow the vendor a 60-day pay cycle due to cash flow considerations. We normally had 30 days. After the vendor would provide the service, he would receive payment from the state 30 days later, or within 30 days. The next steps involve setting up and testing the contractor's FM system, which included an accounting module. Once certain file parameters were agreed to, that process did not take long and went very smoothly. State contacts were then granted access rights to view the reports, so all the business analysts on my team could view the contractor's system and get reports and verify those reports against the accounting, which is the actual books that the state's maintaining. Make sure that everything was in sync. As for internal compliance controls, there was a special emphasis on getting the right players to the table on the front end of the process so we would not have issues developing later on. We involved the agency's accounting director, the internal audit director, the director and the business analyst from our financial management office, as well as the administrative services director, who is responsible for overseeing the processing of real estate procurement transactions. Throughout the time the accounting transition team was in operation, the coordination of actions was critical. Just as a relay team in a track meet has to be worked out, all the coordination between the baton handoff from one runner to the next is very important for the transition team representatives from the state to work it out with the contractors so we can effectively get through the period. Some of the procedures that we worked on, and I mentioned earlier, were worked out in flow charts and whatnot. That information is contained in the pre-reads that you have access to on the NASCA website. Responsibilities needed to be assigned, flow charts developed, and expense accounts mapped. The processes surrounding tenant requests had to be treated separately. We wanted to make sure that the special requests by our tenants that weren't in the normal course of a scope of business didn't reflect negatively on the contractor's performance. You know, the cost associated with those TRs is held out in a different manner, so it's not shown as a cost incurred by the contractor for the performance of his duties in the KPI schedule. And the last item I have lists the vendor hotline. As mentioned earlier, there were instances post-go live involving the vendor community whereby they'd continue to send invoices to the state rather than the contractor. Or in some cases, the vendors were not clear on the fact that they needed to send a portion of their invoices to the new FM contractor for facilities, for FERF facilities, while continuing to send their other invoices to other state agencies whose facilities were not in FERF. So the announcement of a vendor hotline greatly assisted in addressing any confusion on where vendors were supposed to send their invoices. In addition, that vendor hotline helped to alleviate any misunderstanding or perceived payment delay which occurred during the process, worked out for a new payment process that allowed the contractor a 60-day pay cycle. So that was that was our way of getting the word out to the vendor community by the changes. Well, those are the issues that we worked through from the accounting perspective. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, so there we go. So I think we're ready for Q&A. You want to get us started?
I want to add to the presentation that one of the revelations during the transition is when I informed JLL that a good portion of their records were going to be open to the public, subject to the Tennessee Public Records Act. And that caused a lot of consternation, and I spent a lot of time with their attorneys. We were working out what was theirs and protected and what would be open, because under Tennessee case law, and it's federal case law too as it applies, and my guess is in most, if not all of your states, your courts or your laws might reflect this, that if a private entity in contract with the government is acting as the quote-unquote functional equivalent of state government, then their records, to the extent they are involved with that governmental activity, are going to be open and subject to the Public Records Act, which in Tennessee, any citizen of the state can ask for a public record or a copy, a right to inspect or get a copy, and they have to be given access within 7 calendar days unless there's a good reason. And as a matter of practice, though, whenever we get a request from the media or citizens for records that might involve some of JLL's actual records, I contact their attorneys and make them aware of it, and at least give them an opportunity to take a look and determine whether or not they want to try to oppose it before we grant it. And we have I believe we did that for some of the records for this that we've included, but we cleared that first with their counsel. But that's important as you engage, if you undertake these activities and talk to prospective contractors and proposers. You need to tell them that on the front end if they're going to do business with a governmental entity and take over some of the governmental functions. They too will probably be subject to your open records laws.
I have a couple of questions here that, with regards to the transitioning. One would be with employees and the other one's with contracts. You made some comments that, contracts were reviewed and canceled as necessary. Were there any legalities that you ran into with canceling contracts if they were multiple-year contracts? And then as far as transitioning of employees, I don't know if Tennessee has a Public Employees Retirement Act, or if they don't, were there 401k issues for transferring over to JLL?
I'll take the first part. We had our legal department draft the necessary letters and paperwork to assign those contracts to JLL. I don't recall any issues with that at all, other than, generally the concerns and phone calls. What does this mean? What does this mean for my company? Those kind of things. But certainly no legal issues were incurred in that handoff. And I believe 100% were assigned. Some were continued by JLL. As I pointed out, the security contract were renegotiated to optimize savings.
And Mike, most of our contracts, as part of our standard state contract language, include a termination for convenience clause that, of course, JLL would get to exercise, having been assigned those rights. Do most everybody in here, your states, have a termination for a convenience clause in your 30 days? Yeah, something like that. So JLL was able to exercise that when they felt it was the best thing to do. So we didn't have a lot of problems legally with that process. It went very, very smoothly.
On the issue of the retirement, we were able to work with JLL for the credible service that those 32 state employees had to be reflected when they moved over to JLL. As far as the 401ks, they would rest like any other. You have the option of leaving them or move them to your new employer, so that was not an issue.
Interested in the former run-to-fail mentality and the backlog. Given your current operating budgets, are you tracking what that backlog is, and how many years do you think it'll take to catch up from run-to-fail and get everything where it needs to be?
I assume you're referring to our tracking of deferred maintenance. Yes, we when JLL came on board, they basically, by their assessments, came up with a list of deferred maintenance, which around $650 million at that time, and we are tracking it. As a matter of fact, we're here before long. We should come up with an up-to-date tracking that, but they are keeping up with that because they're the ones bringing forth ideas for the capital projects to deal with those. So yes, we are tracking that.
And Kevin, we made a point of prioritizing the critical life safety matters, and I believe I forget how many of those there were, but all of them have been addressed.
Yes, as a matter of fact, we're fixing to do another assessment survey of those as well, so there could be some more minor, but nothing to the extent that there was in 2013.
One of the big things we think that JLL has helped us with, as you make your list of what is deferred maintenance, is what's the priority of that list. It just was a list before, and so we didn't know, and so whatever we got funding for, we did, essentially. But now we go at it a lot more logically, we think. So this year, our maintenance list that we turned in, when we're asked the question, well, tell us exactly what's your priority. We said, well, this is the list we got to have. This is this year's ask. And so please give us all of this, and we'll find out how that budget turns out in the end, but so far so good. So we think, again, through our data tracking for this, that we believe over time we're gaining credibility as to what is a real priority and when do we actually have to have it.
Yeah, we're actually doing a 5-year look ahead with Capital Projects Group.
So have you seen a difference pre and post JLL in how much money you've gotten for capital?
It's not really relevant to whether or not JLL is causing us to get additional money. It's more about the education that we're able to do with the officials of the state and legislature and making them understand you cannot build a building and then not expect to start doing maintenance on that facility until the thing is 40 years old. So it's more of convincing them and selling them that we do know what we're doing, we do have a plan to address this, and that they need to partner with us to provide at least a reasonable level of funding each year so we can take bites at the apple till we get it caught up.
Right, and what I was actually getting at was, if you're looking at, hey, we've saved all this money on operating, well, if suddenly you've gotten, you have a lot more capital, you're able to do a lot more of the improvements you should have done, it might not be a total apples to apples pre and post when you look at operating expenses. So that's what I'm curious about.
Let me say it this way. One of the things that we tried to do when we established the Facilities Revolving Fund was to make it self-sufficient, okay? Our original plan obviously worked for about 3 years till the feds got involved in it, so it did not function for a while. Through JLL and the way that we manage our facilities today, the rent that I collect minus the expenses allows me to fund a certain level of capital projects each year, which is what the intent was to begin with. And yes, we're averaging somewhere between $15 and $20 million a year that we can actually fund out of our facility reserve fund, thereby saving having to go across the street to the legislature with hat in hand, like going to your banker saying, please, sir, may I have $148 million, or next year coming back for, 225, then maybe the third year coming back for 75. It gives us the ability of staying consistent to do that across the next 3 to 5 to 10 years.
One of the things I just might add, the argument we're making these last few years is for a certain portion of that funding to be recurring. Typically, it's just been non-recurring, and we just don't know what we would get from year to year. But because of now we're laying out a plan, this is the first year, we hope that a portion of that will be recurring for the first time. And even as the governor has gone around with all the priorities he has, this year's budget, one of his top talking points has been maintenance, of all things, and it to be recurring, which is amazing for education and everything else that he has to deal with. So that's pretty good. Now, one of the things I also must add that I think has helped us this year is we are in the midst of a current project to renovate a building for our legislature. So it's hot on their mind about how buildings are being taken care of and what's the cost and so forth. So as that one is being done, that has helped us in our conversation, we think, with the legislature, because now we get to talk about total cost of ownership with them and what's this building going to cost us as we take it over and so forth. So we think all those things are actually coming together for us to maybe make these dollars more recurring than they have been in the past.
Your tough story going into this is that, to one of your earlier pictures, you didn't change any filters in 25 years. Now all of a sudden you have that run rate cost to replace those filters and do the maintenance. So that catch-up period, you may spike. Your operating costs before that were low, but they were artificially low because you weren't doing anything. So that's why we were curious about that ramp up and what the backlog would be, because we've got that with some of our agency buildings where, yeah, they've spent nothing. So on 50,000 foot level, God, they're doing great. They got all these buildings and only costing them this, but they're all in run to fail mentality. So it's that catch up period until you're at equilibrium again.
Well, we're starting to get to the point where we can back up our claims. So when we go say we need to replace this chiller, we now have the inspection to say here's where we're getting more and more trouble out of them. Here's where we had to spend more and more maintenance dollars to keep them up. It needs to be replaced. So we can now go across the street and say, not only do we need this amount of money, but this is why, and throw out the backup as to why that needs to happen.
When getting ahead of that life cycle, if you should get 20 years out of something and you get 30 versus today you're getting 10, so you didn't spend any money, but you're replacing capital, so two different buckets.
Right.
On your deferred maintenance, your prioritization, Kevin, do you have a list that then rolls up to a statewide list, and then I believe you used the term, the amount about $25 million or something like that. Is that money prioritized on a statewide level for prioritization, or is that just for your capital complex?
The life safety issue. So we broke those up according to what they were, what it would cost to correct them. and JLL could speak to it probably more detail than me, but majority of them they handled out of their operational budget. Now, a few of them were large issues, such as hand railings on top of buildings for anti-fall devices. You know, when we looked at it in just the downtown area, it was well over $100,000, and therefore it became part of a capital project. But we handled, at least 3/4 of them, Lance, out of our operational budget. We just did it that way.
Okay, but on a statewide level for your deferred maintenance, is it a one list, and then it rolls up to somebody that you look at a statewide
I'm only dealing
level?
with FERF, so I
Okay.
can't speak to outside of that portfolio.
Okay.
Yeah, what we're referring to is that 10 million square feet. Really,
Right.
6.5 of it is what we own of the
right.
10. And that's our concern as we go further for all these properties and thousands of buildings actually outside of that particular portfolio of exactly what we will find. But the way we want to manage real estate going forward is to actually add all those properties to this central portfolio to give us the authority to manage them.
Governor has asked for that single list of capital projects and deferred maintenance. That was what he asked, I guess, probably his first year in office. And so it's been a slow-moving train to move them. We're working on the general government side, but we don't have any really leverage, so to speak, with higher education. They have their own list, but it doesn't all accumulate into one master list. But we are trying to centralize a lot of the real estate decisions. The real estate strategy works towards that to help create a resource, if you will, to help leadership make those hard decisions. I want to be sure everybody's clear. I think it probably is, but this FMO contract will not eliminate your deferred maintenance list. It will reduce it. We use the reference of let's don't add more rocks to that rock pile versus let's remove the rocks in the rock pile. So Tommy described we may pick up a little bit of efficiencies and cost savings that we can apply to some deferred maintenance items, but you've got to infuse capital when you're talking about $650 million. So don't get out of this room thinking all we got to do is outsource and we're going to eliminate all our deferred maintenance in just a matter of years. That's not the case if you're of the scale and magnitude that we are. Anybody else want to comment on that, JLL? Because it does take, the $100,000 only goes so far in these increments. You've got large investments have to be made in your building. So that's the non-recurring fund that we go in and ask for in addition to the recurring funds that John and others have talked about.
I have a question about transparency. How transparent is your deferred maintenance list? Do you make it part of your communication plan? Is it transparent to the public? Do they really understand the gravity of the situation with deferred maintenance?
Yes, I don't remember a hearing. We don't say it. I guess we are putting those numbers out there now. Chris, are we saying X per building per project? No, we're not going that granular with it. But yes, we are. We're constantly talking about deferred maintenance, how big that number is. And frankly, we're doing some estimating of what it is on all these other properties that we don't know what the numbers are at this point. But it has been a major topic for us the last few years.
We provided by a building, don't we? We have an estimate of that by building. And so some of the discussions are, why are we putting that kind of money into a building after it's done, it's only going to be worth this much? So the legislature's asking those questions now because they are aware of those kind of magnitudes of, wow, we had $90 million to deferred maintenance on this one building?
One question, sorry, from the live stream was, how do you all calculate your deferred maintenance costs, since there's no standard practice around that?
Let me start because one of the topics is what I found here is we need to define what deferred maintenance actually is. It's not just the construction cost of something. We have all these other soft costs that go with it. And even in the state's deferred maintenance number, many times we'll put furniture, paint, move, literally everything into that number. So everybody seems to have a little different calculation to what deferred maintenance is. So we tend to use this large number with everything that is in it for deferred maintenance. When we ask JLL here's a project, what they'll tend to give us, and we need to add to it, is what's the real construction cost for that. And then we will add all of our other state costs, so to speak, hiring the architect and all those things that ultimately wind up in the deferred maintenance real cost for it.
That's the extend the life cycle mentality. Or you also mentioned things like fall protection and your lockout tag. You know, things I hate to say you've been lucky because nothing's happened. That's money that you're going to spend to protect something from the future versus getting the value. You know, one person falls obviously, but if nobody ever fell off the roof, you're fine. The other question, John, you and I talked about last night a little bit. You mentioned earlier about FM not being a core function, yet you could theoretically have that same conversation about occupancy planning, project management that is more of a variable demand where facility side can be more static. I was just wondering your thought process on that. And I think part of it is, not to put words in your mouth, FM was the most broken, and you're feeling pretty confident and good about your other two. Your project management and your occupancy planning groups are pretty strong from what I see.
Well, when I refer to it not being a core function, what I mean is, do you need state employees doing it? So one of the things that we talk about in state government is there are certain functions we do believe you need to have state staff doing it, and they need to be state employees. And then there are other functions, it's an important function, and we need to do it, obviously, in FM, but we don't believe we need to have state employees handling those particular jobs. So we looked at that inside our real estate function, for instance, and we believe when it comes to FM, is we don't believe a state employee has to do it, but what we did look at inside our shop is capital projects, because we outsourced that as well. And we had a big company do all project management work for us. And when we looked at that function in our shop, we believed we needed to have state employees doing it for one big reason, is frankly, we could not contract with that project management company the ability to make decisions on behalf of the state, to direct the architect, to direct the contractor to do things. And so what we saw is we had a small state staff who was making all the decisions for this larger project management staff we already outsourced. It was costing more money, and the process was slow. So we decided that needed to be a function we needed to have state employees do, and so we brought all that in-house. Now, as Kevin alluded to, we also asked, in order to bring it all in-house, we needed to pay market rates for all these project management people. We couldn't pay the normal, what the state would do. So they let us do that. So we believe we hired a really good, competent project management staff in-house, and there are less of them than we had it before when we outsourced it, frankly. Much like what JLL is doing when their staff with less people are handling our FM properties. We're actually doing that on the project management side now. So we're saving money, and we believe we have the expertise now in-house who can make those decisions quickly for us.
How did you come to the decision to outsource? And I recognize that 2012 you did an assessment and you looked out and you said things are kind of messed up. But outsourcing is kind of a sea change in your operating practice. Well, what factors did you consider between outsourcing versus developing that expertise in-house?
Primarily the ability of looking over that last 30 years, recognizing it was not a core competency that we had to hire the right people or train them up. I mean, past records spoke for themselves. If we'd been able to do it, I'd like to think we'd already had it in place, and we just did not have the means to put such a plan into place and accomplish where we needed to get, because to do that, you're looking at probably standing up what would be a 5-year program to get to where you want to be, and it was getting worse every day in our buildings. We needed to do something better and really turn it over to the experts, because as John has said, we can manage the contractor to do those things for us, but it's hard to do a non-core competency with state employees.
It's back to that cycle of the administration too. I can't quote the financial status of the state, but were we in a deficit that year when the governor first came in? I think we were.
We have been in a deficit for so long, it's hard to remember when we weren't.
And so, my predecessor came in and he committed to a 2-year term. When you have that kind of, limited amount of time and you've got to cut costs, you're not looking at standing up a new CMS system that costs you millions of dollars that you don't know how. You're not looking to stand up a new training process and hiring staff to train them up. I mean, you're just like, we have got to cut costs. We have got to react quickly. How fast can we get to market and get this done? If we can't do it ourselves, the same quality, same time frame, same cost, we need to outsource. So I mean, it was a sense of urgency too, so when you have a 8-year term to make a decision, when you're in a surplus, you might take a different path, right? But when I've got a limited amount of time to turn this around, we've got low-hanging fruit here, we've got to cut some costs, we think it's better for everybody if we do this. How can we act quickly? In a limited amount of time, you can make those decisions.
Tommy, kind of to his point, do you want to talk about really quickly maybe some of the challenges there were with the civil servant positions, which kind of helped lead to this as well?
Well, the other limitation you had was following the civil service rules, in which we had two classifications of employees: those that were civil service, that had certain rights and benefits provided by their employment, and then you had those others, such as myself, who is executive service, basically appointed by the governor. Now, the difference being, if someone decided tomorrow they did not like the job that I was doing, they basically give me a 2-week notice and tell me have a good life. Okay? For your civil service employees, those with seniority obviously had bumping rights. So that means if I started off as an account clerk some years ago and managed to get up to a program manager, then if I were to decide we were going to rift that position across the state of Tennessee, even down to certain levels, that person could conceivably bump 5 other people to finally rest in where they originally began. Okay? That issue with not being able to get rid of staff who were non-performing under those rules made it difficult to do anything with the existing workforce. Challenged by the fact of, as I said earlier this morning, we are not in state government to make our fame and fortune for retirement. Okay? We are here to service our citizens and provide good customer service. So therefore, you can only pay a certain salary. We're not going to compete with the private sector in trying to pay what they're paying. So because of it, your better talented people are not going to come here. Or, as we have done in the past, we've been fortunate over the years that we would have some really good people that would fall in our lap. For instance, if the economy is really bad, I've literally had accountant positions when I was a fiscal director where I would normally take an okay accountant and put them to work. And suddenly I look up and I'm filling a position and I go, oh my gosh, I can hire a CPA with 10 years experience. I'm going to hire him, knowing that I'm not going to be able to pay him what he can command, but in 2 or 3 years, when the economy turns around, he'll be gone. But I am better off for it for that period of time. Same way with the technical group. We've had those good technical people who've come on board. And then, not surprisingly, a year, 2 years later, they inform us that they've got a better gig. They're going with a private company. They're going to pay them twice what I was paying them, and they appreciate their time here, but they're gone. Those are the kind of challenges that we had where we were in 2012. And even though we went to the TEAM Act that passed that kind of changed the way we do hiring and those firing practices within state government, it is still that a lot of those same issues that you have.
I'd like to add on to that, Tommy. The legal office, of course, in our department, one of its duties is to handle HR disciplinary matters. And I know that probably all of you have had your grounding and your experiences in HR issues. And let me just make this observation. It's not part of our formal presentation, but prior to the facilities management contract, the overwhelming majority of HR disciplinary issues and problems and firings and investigations, unfortunately, were in our property services management ranks. Since that has been outsourced, that has dropped considerably. But we support a lot of functions in government, but unfortunately, in our property services area, they outnumbered all the rest of our department, areas of our department put together as far as HR issues. And so I see a lot of nodding heads out there. Some of you probably have active HR issues right now that are worrying you and aggravating you. Those are gone as far as the property services area. They're Tom's headache now. They're JLL's headache now with their employees. So that is it's not something we want to highlight here, but that has been a very notable consequence.
I got another observation to share too. We talked about communicating to different audiences. I would suggest you consider approaching the legislature as your partner in solving this problem. It's not something the executive branch is going to do by themselves. As you know, funding comes through them. They have to really understand these issues. You've got to bring them along, and they've got to buy into this concept and support you for recurring funding. One of the things we did this year for the first time, which I think was very helpful, you might benefit from, was we can show the cycle of the state's deficit or surplus and the following year how much maintenance funding we got. And so if you can tie that, that helped us convince them that, you know, what the cost benefit was of a total cost of ownership if you fund it with spikes versus consistent funding every year. Overall, you save more money if you have, you know, $30 million a year versus 151 year and 14 the next. And so we made that business case, and I think that resonated with them, and they appreciate that. And so far, the recurring funding is still in the budget as of today. Hadn't been passed yet, but we're still, I think we did a better job explaining to them that cause and effect and asking for them to be our partner in solving this problem together, because in the end of the day, it's using our state resources for things that we would probably prefer to spend on critical services.
They're voting on it today, aren't they, Commissioner?
Yeah.
I'd like to make 2 points from the JLL side, just to sort of round out how I think we've been successful. The first one is, you heard a lot about how we've been able to come in and bring expertise, and we were able to bring that to the state. However, the state gave us a lot of training on how to work effectively in state government. And as Thad pointed out, you know, we listened, whether it's legal, procurement, finance, communication. There was a lot of good training that we had to sit there and learn from the state how to be effective in doing what we do. And you'll talk more about that in the afternoon in governance. But there's been a great, what I would say, cooperation, collaboration on how to do that. So that's number one. Number two, the state put a lot of effort and actually prepared in that 2013 agreement to let us run as fast as we could in the way we do it. They didn't put a lot of barriers or boundaries in our way unless they were important, and there were some, but not a lot. And that really enabled us to, they said, okay, you fix this, you run, you go, this is how we're going to measure you. And they enabled us. And I will tell you, my experience with Tennessee, they enable us much better than most of our private sector corporations do, because we had a lot of people in there saying, this is my turf, and we don't want you to get in the way, or I got to approve that, or let me see what you're doing. None of that happened here. They just said, go, get to the results, and it was very, very efficient. So those two things made us much more successful than in a quick time frame than we typically are.
Kind of along those lines, you may not have caught this item, but on John's customer satisfaction report, the industry average is 85, we're running 97. Well, one could argue that we're paying a premium to get to that 97%. So we've had those conversations with JLL, and in hindsight, we don't think it's worth the pain to reduce it down to 85%. But if you are going ahead with your own and you were able to monitor that a little closely, you may want to try to get closer to that 85, 87 versus the 97. So we did it. We asked him, Kevin, do you remember the details of that? We asked him a few quarters ago to come back with a recommendation of what the cost savings would be to reduce that down closer to the industry average. And I decided it wasn't worth it, but it wasn't that significant. So again, you may say it's worth paying a little premium to have that level of satisfaction if you had so much dissatisfaction beforehand.
And Bob, who established that national average? Is that something that BOMA established, or?
Who established the national average? Can somebody
I
answer?
think that's, it's a little bit, I would say that it is, if you took all of our customers that we do facility management for that are owner occupiers, that's the number. You would see a similar number, but a lot of companies run at lower targets. But that would suggest that's the target that is the average in our group, and I would tell you probably our competitors as well.
I would think, the 85-15 rule, I guess you would say in this situation.
Well, what's interesting for us is internally, we track satisfaction for leases as well as owned buildings. And actually, the 85% comes really close to what leases are for those landlords, because what JLL is doing is trying to get the landlord to do what they're supposed to do. And so the 85% holds pretty true. So we're actually doing better in our own buildings than our leases are doing.
That 97% is a blended of the owned and leased.
Yeah, that's the total.
So since you've implemented the system, has it affected your risk score or your insurance ratings?
That's not under general service. We don't have direct access to that information, but I don't really know that answer. We can find out. I expect
would
it
think
would.
with the window falling out and falling to the ground, that would help your risk rating.
You'd like to think they could sleep better at night anyway.
Commissioner, if I could, we have had, while it's not direct feedback, we have had indirect feedback that the work we've done absolutely has had an impact. I know we received several things from RISC that says, based on some reviews that they've done and the work that's been done, it's definitely impacting the rating.
Yeah, a couple things. When we started the agreement, since all of a sudden now we're the prime contractor, so the state got a huge advantage. All of a sudden I've got a New York investment grade balance sheet in front of me and all these services that I didn't have before. So they were able to shift a lot of risk to JLL. Now we appropriately move it to our subs or hold it ourselves and get insurance. But as we were analyzing that, we worked with the state to try to understand, okay, what is the claims history in facilities, slips, falls, big problems. And they really didn't have good tracking. So, we had to, as we looked at insurance, we had to go a little higher in the premiums because we just didn't have any history. Now we have 3 years of history, and it's positive, and those premiums have come down. But I would say if I'm a state, that's a huge benefit, is moving that risk away from you to a third party that now is going to stand in front of you and have that coverage.
I have another question, and maybe this is more for Trey than anybody else, is on your diversity spend. Did it have any effect on your diversity spend?
Yes, Chris, as I alluded to earlier, we're tracking at 34% now on this contract when our goal was 25%. And even the 25 exceeded what we were doing on our own through those various multiple contracts. So it definitely had a positive effect.
Yeah, so I can speak to that as well. So the CPO asked that they shoot for all contracts to shoot for 17.5%. We've set the KPI for JLL at 25, and actually right now, at the last report, I think they're running 41. So yeah, they're going to get the points for that particular compliance on that.
So over the course of the last 3 years, you were saying there's about approximately $26 million savings, and a large portion of that was through sustainability or utility savings. Have you found a mechanism or a way to be able to retain some of that funding and reinvest it into more sustainable projects like LCPs and automation and whatnot? Or do you just lose your savings at the next budget cycle?
It goes into reserves, and then it can be allocated to whatever our needs would be, whether it's additional energy projects or whether we deem we're going to need some of it to fund a capital project in a particular building. But whatever we're able to save between what we collect in revenue versus what our bottom line is, we don't lose in the budget cycle. It just builds into our reserves.
No, that's one question we don't seem to still be able to answer very well. Where do the savings go? Legislature wants to see a reduction in a line item, but as Tommy described, it goes back into our bucket and we spend on other things, or it reduces our ask for the next year because we have more money to use against that ask. And they really want to capture that money. They want to see that you took out $6 million in energy and you don't need that next year. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. We wanted to have those reserves to spend on other areas without having to have a tight watch on that because it doesn't give us any flexibility. But we appreciate and respect the fact that they want to be sure they know how the money is being used and it's being used in the right areas. But every budget here you hear about our AWS savings, you reduce those operating costs, you say when you reduce the square footage, I want to see it come out. Sometimes it's federal reimbursement dollars. I mean, it just gets very messy really quickly. So if there's some way you all can tell that story better than we have, we struggle with that.
I have a quick question. Was there significant cost savings or long-term from the personnel costs, or was it more of a restructure? The reason I'm asking is because clearly one of the major hurdles you had from an optics standpoint, at very least, was around the personnel, and in the end it was 29 who may have parted ways. So my question is, what's the long-term effect, since it obviously politically was a challenge from that standpoint?
Well, politically, the challenge is trying to still convince the masses that this was the right decision to make and why it's in the best interest of the state of Tennessee, not state government, but state of Tennessee and its citizens. Our charge is to provide better service to our clients at a reduced cost. And we are the central supplier of those services and goods that other departments have to do their jobs with. So it transcends whatever we can reduce their cost to be, means they have more dollars available to service the customers that they have. From a savings point of view, obviously one of those reasons that we looked at going to a reduction in force in the first contract was the cost of personnel. Not only was it the cost being 67 cents a square foot, but the fact of, so what value of services were you getting for that 67 cents a square foot? I can tell you it wasn't anywhere near 67 cents. So that was a lot of the factors that went into the first decision on, so how are we going to do this? What are we going to impact?
Thank you. Well, that was a great discussion, you all. Thank you very much for participating. Can you all help me thank our panelists?